Well, hello. Thank you for tuning in again to our live foot dem. I am Penny from Mike's Sewing Machine Repairs, and well, it's not very interesting television today. Hello. I still can't put my face in, but hello. Now, last video we did, I introduced a special guest, Mr. Finger Puppet, but I found him a little bit too distracting, so I've decided to do something a little bit different. And I'm going to relive my youth and pop on. I know the suspense must be killing you while you're staring at that incredibly invigorating screen, but I have decided to go 80s punk. Whoop, whoop. So, these are cool gloves. My little finger sticks out there, but I think I've put it on wrong. There we go. Okay, so last time we did sharing elastic, and I got super great feedback from that video from all over the place. So while you're watching tonight, hey Debbie, if you could pop in where you're watching from, that'd be really cool, because I had people messaging me asking me for advice from Canada, so it was great, and I love that feedback, and I love helping you all out. The other thing I noticed from my video is I said so a lot, so I'm going to not say so much tonight. So instead of saying so, I'm going to say right. Let's get started. Zippers. Oh, no. Buttons and buttonholes. So I'm not going to have any luck with that. So using buttonhole feet. Before we get started about the actual buttonholes themselves, I want to talk to you about the threads that you're going to use. When you do sewing on your sewing machine, it doesn't matter if you are sewing on a little tiny machine that's your first machine ever that you saved up your pocket money and bought, or if it's a huge big machine that you've been aiming for your whole life and you finally got it. At the end of the day, the stitching that you do will only be as good as two things: the needle that you use and the threads that you use. So one of the things that I often have to help people out with is the machine skipping stitches and giving them trouble, and it is very often due to the thread that they're using. So I'm going to help you understand your threads a bit better. Department stores sell these threads, and sometimes they're in a hang sell packet with a group of 3. Sometimes they've just got plastic wrapped around them and they're 10 for $10 in a big dump bin. But these threads are not very good threads, and they will stretch while you are trying to sew. The fluff will shed off them and get caught in all of the moving parts of your machine, and the actual thread itself will break quite easily while you're trying to do tricky stitches. How are you supposed to know that as a consumer? Because when you look at these, they all look pretty similar. The rule of thumb that I tend to teach by is if the spool of thread, if the manufacturer has gone to the effort to print the name of the thread, the meterage, the color code on the actual spool, either by stamped on the spool or as a sticker, then that's the thread that you want to use. If they've made the effort to invest in that technology for their thread, then that's the thread that you want to pop into your machine. And to be honest, this thread here, it might go on special cheap sometimes, but it's not much cheaper than these threads here. But when you think about how much more effort you have to go to get these to work, they're more expensive. So we're just going to pip them. And when you buy threads, the two that we use and sell and recommend is good old-fashioned Mazant, which is 1,000 meters. I think we sell for $7.50. And then this guy here, this Aerofill by Madeira. This has a huge range of colors. It's a smaller spool for $3. I think it's 100 meters. Whichever thread you buy, make sure it's stamped and looks pretty. If it looks pretty, it'll do the job. Threads, done. Lecture, done. Okay, and needles. I swear by Schmetz needles. Most technicians will tell you to use Schmetz needles. Schmetz, if you're not familiar, looks like so. These needles will give you a great result. Again, another really key indicator as to whether or not the needles are any good for your machine is if the packaging looks good. There is some department stores out there that sell a brand of needles that are so poorly made that the holes aren't even in them. The packaging looks really cheap and nasty, but they're not actually priced that cheap and nasty. So what you want to do is look at the packaging for your needles. If you can get Schmetz, get Schmetz. I think for between $6 and $8 is the going price for a pack of different types of needles from Schmetz. That's a good needle for you. Again, the number of problems we've solved just by changing the needle, and I don't think people believe us when we pop out the needle and put a new one in and the problem is solved. All right, needles and threads, done. Tonight we're using Result thread, and I'm using orange on calico again, our preferred palette, so that you can see clearly what is going on. So I've popped in a bobbin of orange Result thread, and the needle that's in here is a denim needle, I think. It is. I can tell because it's got markings on it. It's a denim needle, and I've chosen denim for today because we're going to go through lots of different layers and thicknesses, and it's a little bit more hard work. So whenever you think, I wonder if I need a stronger needle, you should put your denim needle in. So now we've got that all threaded. Let's go sewing. All right. Buttonhole foot. Buttonhole feet essentially all do the same thing. They look super different. And I've actually run around the shop, but just before we started, I had a Kit Kat, so I was a bit hyped up. And I got myself all the different buttonhole feet that we had lying around to show you an example. So this is your standard brother buttonhole foot. There's two types of Janome buttonhole feet. This is a Janome sensor buttonhole foot from the good old-fashioned 655R. And then the Janome standard unsensor buttonhole foot doesn't have that attachment. This is a Benina buttonhole foot with a sensor. This is an older style 5mm, sliding buttonhole foot. So you can see there it actually slides up and down. And then this one here, for those of you who are Husqvarna and Pfaff owners, you'll recognize this one. This is a modern day Pfaff and Husqvarna buttonhole foot. We're working with our little brother today. So we're going to put in our brother buttonhole foot. The way buttonholes work, and I got a little piece of paper here to draw something for you because I do need to draw a picture. Essentially, right across the board, buttonholes start with a zigzag across the bottom to hold all together. A skinny zigzag up one side, a zigzag at the top to hold all together, and a skinny zigzag down the other side. What these feet do is they help us hold everything in place while we make that buttonhole, but they also help us make that buttonhole the right size. If you have a buttonhole foot that looks like this, then you have what's called a 4-step buttonhole. It might be white plastic, it might not have this attachment on it, but essentially you can't do exactly the same thing we're doing tonight. You have to take a little bit more manual control over it. You'll actually tell it to sew this part, then tell it to sew this part, and so on. So 4-step buttonholes are a little bit different. We'll fly back over and cover them again a little bit further down the track. Most of the machines going upwards are 1-step, so that's what we're focusing on today. Now, 1-step buttonhole foot slides up and down like this. Holding the foot with your hand and then using your thumb, you open and close this gap here. And what that does is it gives you an opening for, you know what would be clever? A button. Let's go. It gives you an opening for a button so that you can have your opening to suit the size of the button that you're going to do. It holds it in place. But it's important to stress that this is just a guide. This is designed to get the buttonhole the right size for that button. If you're sewing at 2 in the morning because the kids have finally gotten to sleep and you really need some you time and you don't have the right size button, you can guesstimate. Do you love my gloves? I love them too. And then when you guesstimate, you are going to determine the size of that button, and then when you go shopping later, you'll have to do your best guess to get it right. So what putting the button does, we'll put that back in, help you relate to it a bit better. What having that button does is adjust these little notches here. And these notches are going to communicate with your sewing machine and tell your sewing machine what size the button hole needs to be. So off goes our foot. This guy here, again with machine feet, if the letter is the right way around, if you can see that, see the little A on there for the buttonhole foot. If the letter's the right way, the foot's the right way. If the letter's upside down, then the foot is upside down. We're going to attach it to where our normal foot clicks on, and on most machines, the lever that you use to lift your foot up and down, if you push on that when it's up a little bit higher, it will lift the foot a little bit higher. Do you see that? So now we're going to pop that on, click it into place. Step 1, done. Step 2, oh, turn on the machine. That really should have been step 1. It's alive. Okay, so step 2, we're going to get ourselves some fabric. Pop it under there just to hold everything in place. And step 3, choose a buttonhole stitch. So this particular little brother has half a dozen buttonholes. I'm going to do just a plain square one tonight. Now for tidiness, this thread here, it actually needs to go through your foot. And I know some people like to struggle to thread it through, like you are by hand through this hole. But what you need to do is just pop your foot onto a bit of fabric, nothing particularly important where you put it, and do your needle down and up. So either down and up with your button or turn your flywheel. And then when you lift up, you've done one little stitch, when you lift up your foot and pull your fabric through, the stitch has come out and your foot has the thread through it in the right spot. Done. Okay, so buttonhole is selected, buttonhole foot is on. Now we need to reach up underneath. I'll try and do this as classily as I can without my hand covering. In the back here is a little slider that goes up and down. That's your buttonhole foot lever, and it pulls down and actually fits between the 2 notches of your buttonhole foot. And what happens is, as the buttonhole foot travels along, it'll hit that little lever and tell it to do the next step of the buttonhole. Which is why when we have our different buttons in there, we have different size openings and we get a different size buttonhole. Because you guys don't need to watch me sew a great big long buttonhole tonight, I'm just going to make it really short. So let's do a little tiny button. Oh, 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 oh. Like so. Done. Pop that back on. Chuck our fabric underneath. Needle down, needle up. And oops, sorry, my bad. Down, needle up, and pull that thread through. All right, we are ready to go. Now, buttonholes actually do a lot of tight zigzags together. Really close fine zigzag for the entirety of the buttonhole, around all 4 sides. And if you try and just do it on 2 layers of fabric, your fabric's actually going to gather up a little bit because of the stress that the buttonhole stitching causes. If you take your sewing machine to any technician in the world and say, hey, my buttonholes give me trouble, the technician's going to look over you, at you over his wise old glasses and say, have you put stabilizer or interfacing in the buttonhole? And you'll say, yes, of course I have, because you really, really should. This is a bit of tearaway. We use it for machine embroidery. It's something you can buy by the meter from most sewing machine and haberdashery shops. And what it does, it's really strong. It's like compressed paper. And we're going to put it in the middle of our buttonhole. In this case, I'm going to put it behind it so you can see what it does. So what that will do is it'll take all the stress of the buttonhole. If you're doing something on interfacing, which is usually the case for dressmaking, usually if you're putting a buttonhole in, there's interfacing there. The interfacing will typically do this job for you instead. So that's what makes the front of your shirt all stiff. But sometimes your interfacing isn't strong enough and you still need to put this here. And don't fear, it'll all just tear away when you're finished. So fabric in place, tear away underneath. We're not going to fuss too much about where the button is going to sew or the buttonhole is going to sew. We're just going to go ahead and do it, keeping in mind that 99.999% of buttonholes sew from the front to the back, and they do that, seems frustrating, but they do that so that you can line up your buttonhole exactly where you want it, which you couldn't do if you were doing it the other way. So starting here, buttonhole lever's down, buttonhole is selected. Speed is on medium. Now, some people say I drive my car a little bit faster than I should, but it's only because driving safe to the conditions in which I am driving, and it's the same for your sewing machine. Even though your sewing machine might be able to do 1,050 stitches per minute, you should still slow down to about a medium speed on your buttonhole. So medium speed, foot pedal, put my foot flat to the floor. Let's go. Oh. So what happened there is my buttonhole started sewing forward. Why? Because I've pulled my buttonhole lever down and I've put it in front of the notches of the buttonhole foot rather than making sure it's between them. So I did that on purpose. It was a deliberate mistake so that I could show you one of the most common things that frustrate people after forgetting to pull the buttonhole lever down is if you pull it down and put it in the wrong spot in relation to the foot, it'll confuse the foot and it'll think you're in a different position. So to reset that, I'm going to choose the buttonhole stitch again. So if you've got a mechanical or a computerized machine, if you've had to stop mid-path for your buttonhole, reset the buttonhole by selecting the stitch again. Cool? All right, let's go. Now that I've done that deliberate mistake, this will be smooth sailing. Stimulating stuff, I'm going to talk over a little bit. It's going to stitch a reinforcing stitch first and then come back and do the zigzag stitch over the reinforcing stitch and then finish it at the end. Different brands will do it a slightly different way, but they can't escape the fact that they need that reinforcing and that zigzag to hold it all together. So we're now done. And there is a buttonhole. Don't worry about this. This is nothing to worry about over here. This is your buttonhole here. So, right. Now, buttonhole settings. That's a straightforward buttonhole with the default settings of the machines. And the default setting of the machine is 5 millimeters width. So the width is 5. And the length is 0.4. So explaining that, it means that the whole total width of the buttonhole here is 5 millimeters. The length is the distance between each needle point as the stitch sews. So in this case, the distance between each time the needle makes a zig or a zag is 0.4 of a millimeter. If we made this, say, 2.4, our buttonhole would look stupid because it wouldn't be close enough together to do the job. And in fact, on most computerized machines, they won't let you make that mistake. But if you're doing it on mechanical and you're trying to muddle it out for yourself, if you're finding that your stitch just looks too big and gappy, you need to reduce the distance between those needle piercings, and that means taking your stitch length down, which is why we did it at 4. We're going to do the same buttonhole again, exactly the same settings, but I'm going to take the width right up to the maximum width of this machine, which is 6, and I'm going to take the length up a little bit so that you can see the difference. So this is now 6 millimeters wide and a length of 0.8. All right, let's do it. Oops. Let's go. I'm going to do a little dance with my gloves on. All right, let's do it. So by ratio, the whole buttonhole itself is wider, which means the actual zigzags don't change a lot that goes up and down, but the distance between the zigzags does. So there is your same buttonhole, but here you can see it's wider across there than here. Because we've stretched out the space, we have a bigger gap in the middle. And because we made the stitch length longer, we made it 0.8, we have a bigger gap in between those zigzags. So we've changed the nature of that buttonhole just by changing those fundamental settings for it. Groovy? If we go the other way and make it quite skinny, again, sometimes if you've got a computerized machine, it will limit how fat or thin you can make your buttonhole. It's programmed to look after itself. If you're using a mechanical machine, you have to test it to make sure you're happy with it. I've done this guy quite small. I've done it 0.3 stitch length, so very close together, and 3 millimeters wide. Let's do it. So everything about this is tinier. In order to be able to fit all the bits and pieces that need to fit into 3 millimeters of space, the zigzags up each side are teeny weeny. And because we've made the stitches closer together, the whole thing is tighter to look at. See that guy there? So this is the exact same buttonhole. All we've done is change it from the default settings to wider settings to skinnier settings. So what I hope you take from this tonight is that you can experiment with your buttonholes a little bit more. Cool? All right, so let me check my notes. Where's my notes? Okay, so we've done a lecture about threads, got the basic one step done. All right, so now doing buttonholes on different things. Let's just say you want to do buttonhole onto something really thick, like webbing. So I've done some here, just to test it out. You can do it on this webbing, but what we have to start being mindful of is the properties of this webbing. It feels quite thick. So you think, cool, this can look after itself. But when you look at this, it's got all this play in it. And that's going to come into trouble when it comes to putting a buttonhole in there, because despite the fact that it's strong, it's still got a lot of movement. And true for putting it through an embroidery machine as well. We don't want that movement. We want to try and resist that. So we're going to get a piece of tearaway and pop underneath it, like so. And because this is quite spongy, And if you are doing buttonholes on anything that's spongy, you want to add a layer of this stuff. It's magical stuff called Solvay. And those of you with embroidery machines will remember Solvay. You use it on top of towels. What its job is to smooth down piles or uneven lumps. And in this case, we have uneven bumps in our webbing. So we're going to put it over the top. So we have the webbing in the middle, Solvay on the top, and tear away underneath. I'm going to put it in here. We're going to reset the buttonhole so that we're back to its defaults. And on most machines, resetting the stitch number, re-choosing the number will reset it back to its default settings. Let's go. So what the Solvay is made of is gelatin. Believe it or not, it's completely water soluble and it can be easily removed, and whatever's left over will just wash away. And it's perfect for doing any sort of sewing, not just embroidery, where you are sewing over lots of fluff. And what we've done here is filled in all those little gaps and bumps that the webbing has. So that's our buttonhole, all sandwiched in there. We're going to remove the Solvay, like so. And as you can see, that buttonhole tends to be floating on top of that rather than sunk down into it. And this tear away at the back, we're just going to take it out. And then if you sit there for a second, you can pull the fluff out, but a wet cloth will make it disappear. It's like wet tissue. So that's gone through that webbing just fine. Denim needle in there so the thickness isn't a problem, and Solvay on top because it's fluffy or lumpy, stop it from sinking into the plush of the webbing. Once you've sewn a buttonhole, where's my scraps? How do you cut it? I believe that Benina still sells or includes with their machines an actual punch that you hit with a hammer and make the hole. What most of us do though is use our seam ripper. So seam ripper, seam ripper, seam ripper. Oh, that's right. I've got a Clover seam ripper. If you don't have a Clover seam ripper, then every time you make a mistake, you'll be more upset than if you had to unpick it with a Clover one. It's super duper 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 sharp, fine point, and easy to hold, and they're about $7, $7.15. We're going to use our seam ripper to cut open this buttonhole. And to do that, we're going to start here and enthusiastically push through. See? Easy peasy. But it's worth keeping in mind that buttonholes are typically the last thing that you do, and you're very keen about finishing, and what you can very often easily do is just tear it, burst into tears. So to stop that from happening, we're going to put a pin right across the top of our buttonhole like so, and then push and stop at the pin. And we have just opened up our buttonhole. Now, for those of you who watched last time, thank you. You'll recall that I had to use my clock because I didn't charge my watch. I've charged my watch and I set a reminder to tell me to stop blabbing on and move on to buttons. And it's now time to finish up with buttons. So that's your buttonhole. Done. Buttonhole foot. Check. Now, when we're finished, put the buttonhole foot away and remember to put the little buttonhole lever up. Again, a computerized machine will beep at you and nag you and you'll end up apologizing to it. Manual machine, you may find that you're sewing funky and you can't work out why. It's because you forgot to put that buttonhole lever up. Let's talk about putting on a button. We're going to use a foot that comes standard with most brother machines, called an M foot or a button application foot. Janome, and it should be said that all brands make a button application foot. They just call it different things and they look a little bit different. Janome's looks like so, Singer's looks like this, and I don't have a Husqvarna or Benina one in front of me, but they're all a similar ilk. They're designed to hold the button into place. We're going to use our brother one today. We're going to use it on this button here. The way your buttonhole foot works is your button goes in like so, and the two holes of your button go up against these little notches here and here. See that? And we can do that either on the machine with the buttonhole foot on the machine or in our hand before we put it on if it's easier. On your brother machine, you have this extra little slider, and what this does, oh, there we go. And what this does is it tells your machine, or when it stitches, to make a bigger loop around the button, and it's for thicker things where you need a thicker toggle for your button. So it's important to make sure it's pushed out of the way. So step one, buttonhole foot is in the buttonhole foot application foot holder. If you don't have a brother one and you're using a Janome one, it's a similar sort of deal, but instead of clipping into the foot goes over the top. See, it's got like a little ridge here. and holds the button into place. Like that. So similar sort of thing. Check, done. Now I hear you stressing out because you're thinking, Penny, how can we possibly sew into that button and not wreck it? What we want to do is a couple of things. The first thing we want to do, some machines actually have a button application stitch in them. This one does, but we're not going to use it because I want everyone to know how to do it. We're going to just go to our main menu and choose a zigzag stitch. And we're going to check the width of the zigzag stitch in a minute. And we're going to make sure that the zigzag stitch is the right width, that it goes into that hole there and that hole there without hitting the button. And we're going to do that by hand turning our machine. But we need to also stop the feed dogs from moving and trying to sew through that button. And we can do that by a couple of methods. One, you can actually reduce your stitch length to 0. So if you change your stitch length to 0, just like with the buttonhole that we stitch with the smaller stitch length, the smaller the length, the closer the stitches together. If you go 0, then there's no length, there's no movement. But a lot of people find that a little bit disarming, and indeed on some mechanical machines, it's not 100% 0 movement. So we're going to go an extra step, and we're going to reach around the back of the machine on this model. Some models it's around the front, down the bottom. Some models it's over here on the underneath at the side near the power supply, and we're going to drop the feed dogs. Just watch here, and big clunk. Oh, there we go. So those feed dogs have disappeared. So now even if we had the stitch length set to 5, those feed dogs would be moving trying to feed the button through, but they're actually not up, so they're not going to cause any effect or any movement. You do this for free motion work as well. So the feed dogs are down, buttonhole foot goes onto the machine. Whoop, my gloves made me fumble. I'm going to do it again here, like so. Click that on into place. And then make sure that our little holes are lined up here and here. Bit of fabric. I have tons of fabric piled up here to test, but I'm only just using this one poor little piece. Okay, so, another sew. All right then, we're going to go ahead and pop our fabric underneath. Everything's set as we want it. 0 for the length, the feed dogs are down, the button application foot is holding the button into place. Now we need to do the tricky part, and that is just check where our needle is going to go. I'm carefully hand turning my flywheel always towards you. Flywheels like to travel towards you. I'm hand turning it down and making sure it clears that hole. And I'm going to do the other side. And it's just touching, I don't know if you can see that in my professional footage, in the video, but the needle is just touching against that button. So we're going to make the hole a little bit, the zigzag a little bit wider. So instead of 3.5, I'm going to move the zigzag up to 4. And if you look at the needle when I do that, the needle moves across. And now it's going in and not touching anything. I'm happy with that. Let's just do it. And there is my button stitched on by machine. And we're finished, and we just need to pull the button out towards us. And there it is, all done. And if you have a button like this, then you're going to go one here and one here. Unfortunately, you can't go the traditional crossways because that opening is just too wide. Why is it wide? Because most of us have a 7mm machine. This machine is 7mm, which means the opening here is 7mm wide. On your newer big Janomes, Husqvarnas, Boninas, and your big brothers, they now have a 9mm width. So the stitch can actually travel 9mm from left to right. And then some of your smaller, more entry-level machines, they have a 5mm width, which means the distance here is 5mm. So when buying feet, it's important to know that sort of thing. And it's very important to understand with your button that if your machine only sews 5mm, it can't stitch those wider spaces. But if your machine sews 9mm, it sure can. All right, now that we've finished and we've made up our wonderful cloak with buttons all over it, we want to pack her up so we can sew another day. And we're going to talk about raising these feed dogs. If you bring your sewing machine into us and say, I need to get my sewing machine serviced because the feed dogs won't go up, 9 times out of 10, I will say, here, let me fix that for you and send you right home. When you click your feed dogs back into position, I've just clicked at the back, nothing happens. And then you freak out because nothing's happened. Your feed dogs pivot on a really heavy angle. So when you drop them, they drop in and out of the way. When you click them back into place, you are securing the mechanism to move them back up, but you aren't actually doing anything to move them yet. To move them back up to where they belong, we're going to turn that flywheel. I'm just going to unthread that needle so you can see. I'm going to turn that flywheel, and if you listen, well, you couldn't quite hear it, but those feed dogs have now clicked back up into place and doing what they're supposed to do. So if you've dropped your feed dogs and they don't go back up, sometimes there is a mechanical problem and it needs to be fixed. And I know a really great little brother who could do that, but most of the time it is that you haven't turned your flywheel to put them back up. Okay, so that's buttons and buttonholes. In a nutshell, just looking at my notes. Oh, one more thing I need to say. Happy birthday to Mum for tomorrow. It is Mum's birthday tomorrow. Happy birthday, Munga Bean. If you would like to continue watching, that would be super duper great. Next month we are going to do, I think I have let the cat out of the bag. We're going to do zippers and zipper feet next month. No pressure, Penny. So same time, same place. I loved all the positive feedback I got. Love the fact that you guys were all sharing my video, our video, Michael. Stay tuned. Catch you next time. My watch, which is plugged in under my glove, says it's time to go. Bye, guys. See ya. There's the off button there.